something was wrong. There are some clear errors in the book answers. It was not the first one. There are some book answers that are completely kooky, and I couldn't, and also the method or some of the explanations were lacking for some of the assumptions. So I decided to do a video on it, so I went by myself now and did the problem, come up with it, do it. There's some things I don't care about it. There's some rich background worth discussing, and let me show you here. And there's some things in the book answer that are clearly wrong, and I don't know if those are just typos, because the ones that I are certain are wrong could just be typographical errors, but some of the assumptions seem unfounded to me. So let's look at this. So here we have Drosophila pseudo-obscura were collected from traps set out in a forest. This is a wild fly. Right away, this is not melanogaster, but it's in the same genus, so that means it's quite reasonable for us to expect that the biology of which we know for melanogaster is also true in pseudo-obscura, such as male Drosophila not undergoing crossing over. That's also true here. Presumably the eye pigment pathway, which we have seen briefly, also could be. That's not really relevant here, though. Yeah, I mean, it comes up, but we don't need to know anything about it. So it's a wild organism. It's known to have a lot of genetic diversity. It's North American. One unusual female had light orange eyes instead of wild type red color. So you've seen this in the lab, the red color. And when we see light eyes, immediately the sort of things that come to mind, when we see an eye phenotype, the things that come to mind are what kind of mutations and what kind of genes would do that. And one can imagine issues of natural frequency of mutations, mutational pressure, and changes in the allele frequency and gene pool and all of that stuff. But one would assume that the eye pigment biochemical pathways, anabolic synthesis, are similar. We've seen something of that. There are problems in the book that are based on that. So remember that a book problem is typically sometimes completely hypothetical, but often taken from a real situation and then simplified or modified for the purposes of a book problem, which are educational, unlike an exam problem, which are for assessment purposes. So we might imagine approaching it. So, well, what do we know about Drosophila eye pigment biochemistry? And we've seen problems like that, but that's not what's going on here. But nonetheless, it's there. She was placed in a vial. So right away there's a mutation, and we have this thought, okay, there's a mutation. Well, let's read the question a bit more. One unusual female, so this is unusual, had orange eyes instead of wild type red color. So this is the only one they found. It's not common, it's not known. She was placed in a vial containing food without a mate, since female Drosophila can store sperm from prior matings. In fact, this pseudo-obscura tends to rely upon that. So there are multiple fathers. The eggs she develop into adults. So this is not a test cross. This is a wild female mated with an unknown set of males, multiple males. The eggs all will be her eggs, but we don't know anything about the fathers. The eggs she laid developed in adults, some which exhibited a second unusual trait, that they had black instead of the wild type gray body color. We've seen gray body color for melanogaster earlier. Let's not assume any knowledge of what that is. Her offspring led to the following phenotypes. Okay, right away though, there's some things that should be happening in our mind, is that there's a new, so we have wild type red versus this mutant orange, light orange. Okay, so the idea comes, well, there's a mutation, so that mutation could be dominant or recessive. it could be X-linked or autosomal. It's not Y-linked, it's the female, and we know nothing about this. We might think some things are more likely than not, knowing the number of chromosomes. Maybe it's more likely it's autosomal than X-linked. Maybe it's more likely if there's a new mutation and the nature of the what's known about the eye pigment. It's easier for us to conceive of recessive mutations, but we don't know anything about that. We have to treat all of these as possible. So those are 4 possibilities. It could be dominant X-linked, dominant autosomal, recessive X-linked, recessive autosomal, and we have to consider those before we can rule them out, just like we would in any pedigree. Okay, so so we have this, and I'm going to say, let's say, and let's use standard notation, wild type versus mutant. So wild type, we're going to say, is plus, and the locus is named after the mutation, so it may be a small o, or it could be dominant, so it's either recessive, which is that, versus versus wild type, or dominant. I'm going to put a dot there, not because it's the sun, but to show that it's a capital. Could be like that capital letter there. Could be X-linked or autosomal. We don't need the symbol. So we have to distinguish. We already have a way in incipient notation to describe that. Okay, so she laid these eggs, and we see light orange eyes. So whatever this adds up to, it looks like something around 80 or so. Light orange eyes, gray body, female. Light orange eyes, gray body, male. Male and female equal, male and female equal, male, female equal, male, female equal. That doesn't rule out X-linkage, but it means we don't have to think about it right now. So far it isn't. And we see that if we separate these 2 phenotypes, orange, the eye and the body, we'll see orange, 16, 20. If we add up all the orange, 16, 20, 2, and 1, what is that? That's 38, then 39, and then we compare that to the red, 2, 1, so there's 2 here, and 42, so 44 versus 38, so pretty similar, equal abundance of orange and red eyes. And let's look at that first. So what could be that if the female is recessive? Let's say the female, let's go through this. Let's say it's recessive, so the female had so that would mean the female, if recessive, were mated to probably a wild type male, and what we would expect then, if that's the case, we expect all the male produce this, all the female produce that, and all the offspring are wild type. So that's not what we see. We see orange 50-50. So if the female were if the allele for orange eyes is dominant, then the female in question is likely is heterozygous. That's more likely. If there's unlikely that she would be homozygous dominant, because that would mean that the allele frequency high enough, we'd probably seen it before. We expect to see things in single occurrences, rare things singly, rather than 2 improbable events at the same time. So if that's the case, then she produces 2 gametes, and the male would be wild type, presumably, because that's most common, or most of the fathers, and we would see 50-50. We would see half of the offspring are orange and half are red. So that's I think we've ruled out recessive and concluded that the orange eyes are dominant. So let's continue with that thought in mind. Going back here, we say, okay, the gray, if combining the gray, we have 16, 20, 22, 20. Okay, so what are we up to? That's 78 versus black, the mutant, is 5. So we have 87 to 5. So what do we have? We have 87 to 5. That doesn't look like any ratio we can make sense of. But of course, she has multiple matings, and so we have to consider that some of the males. So let's look at black now. We're going to assume also that, let's start with the assumption that the black body is recessive. Could it be dominant? Sure. Could it be recessive? Sure. So let's consider this now. Maybe we can't distinguish them yet. So here it is. We have a female, and we think we know her genotype at that. And the possibility is that of unknown linkage. We don't know if there's linkage. We don't know if what her genotype is yet. And the male, therefore, well, we suspect that this orange is rare, so we're going to expect that the male is let's make this simpler. Let's just consider the black versus gray. So the black versus gray, well, we could imagine that it's recessive, in which case let's use a nomenclature like that, or dominant, where we will say this. So the individuals that have black body would either be this, if recessive, or this. Now, we know that she was not, so let's consider, we have the issue of dominant recessive, and we have linked and unlinked. And we have multiple fathers, so in this case, there's going to be some proportion of fathers so what would the fathers be? The fathers are going to be, some are wild type, some may be heterozygous, some may be homozygous, right? We have all three possibilities there. And in this case, we can have some wild type fathers and some heterozygous fathers, and we don't think we should be considering the likelihood that this just seems, as I said, a combination of two rare events, so that doesn't make sense. So if we imagine then that let's start with recessive and see if this works. So let's imagine that the population is filled with some males of this sort and some of this sort, and we see that the offspring here, we do have black bodies. So if recessive, then the female, the mother we're talking about, female 0, I'm going to call her. Let me do that, because otherwise it looks like orange. 0, she has to be heterozygous, because some of her offspring are that, and she is then crossed with some males who might be wild type. She is crossed with some males that might be heterozygous, and she even might be crossed with some males that are homozygous wild type, although we need not do that. We need only these. If dominant, then the female needs only be wild type, and the male could be this. If so, we would expect that, right, 50%, 1/2 of offspring are black. Well, that's not the case. So that means we can rule this out and assume that's recessive. I'm going to stop here because my video is too long and that causes some problems anyway.